my pleasure to be speaking with Matthew Ehret, who is editor-in-chief of the Canadian Patriot Review and co-founder of the Montreal-based Rising Tide Foundation. He's written hundreds of articles ahead of me, I think, and at least 6 books. I count 6 books. Is there more than 6?
No,
okay. The latest is The Clash of Two Americas, Volume 2, The Unfinished Symphony. So we interviewed you earlier on Volume 1, so now we're picking up with about the death of McKinley around 1900. Greetings, good to talk to you.
Hey, Ellen.
Yeah, you call it the two Americas. Now, obviously, you're not talking about North America, South America. I mean, you're talking about the two faces that the United States has presented to the world, like over the last 300 years. One is benign, and one is sort of more, sort of imperial. Or anyway, do you want to explain what you mean by the two Americas?
Yeah, I can do that. Well, speaking as a Canadian, since I'm based in Montreal and I run the Canadian Patriot Review, I got to tell you, like going through the education system here, I was wired at a very young age, before I had any real political awareness of anything, to hate and kind of fear the United States. And that's just something that is built into, for many generations, the educational process for Canadians. This goes back, I think, well over 150 years. It's gotten really bad, though. So there's a certain image painted of the USA as the empire, the global supervillain of sorts, which, unfortunately, when you look at the behavior of the United States, especially since the murder of John F. Kennedy and his brother, it has increasingly lived up to those very negative expectations. So it sort of played into I'll use the word, okay, I'll use a harsh word, demonic sort of imagery that we're being fed. And Canadians are often told that's all it is. There's nothing else. Since 1776, when we were enlightened enough to, avoid being a part of a messy, bloody revolution that didn't need to happen, we are told, because if we just waited with patience from our slightly overbearing, mother country, Great Britain, she would have naturally abolished slavery and given us our freedoms anyway. We didn't have to go through that type of destructive process to create a republic. We're happy being a constitutional monarchy. That's what we are. Look, and so this unidimensional image of the USA is presented, and it creates. For me at least, it took me a long time before I started realizing that 1776 and the events that were put into motion by Benjamin Franklin and many of his collaborators. And in our last interview on my volume 1, we talked about the international dynamics surrounding the events of 1775 to 83, which involved, people within high positions of influence, obviously in France, we know that, but also within Spain, within Germany, Prussia, Poland, Ireland, India. We had the Hyder Ali and the Mysore Rebellion that saw themselves in a common fight against the British Empire to create a new type of world, which is the point. The Muslim Hyder Ali Rebellion against the British Empire, which absorbed, something like 20% of the British military fleets into trying to put that down. Hyder Ali's son, Tipu Sultan, had written letters to the Continental Congress saying, we are in this together for a new world. Russia, Catherine the Great was organized through her colleague, who was a woman who was the head of the Russian Academy of Sciences and a great friend of Ben Franklin, who he met in France. Morocco, Sidi Mohammed, the emperor of Morocco, was also organized by Benjamin Franklin's networks to also give protection to American ships against Barbary pirates that were under the influence of the British Empire. So, it was an international dynamic. And so we're not given any of that. And I don't even think Americans are really given that anymore. Maybe it was known in previous generations a bit more, but today it's obscured. But so you start looking into, well, what is the United States? Why do these American presidents, why do so many of them die while in office? 8 of them. And if you add in Alexander Hamilton, who had presidential material, who was shot and killed by Aaron Burr, the founder of the guy who basically was the founding father of Wall Street, the creator of the Bank of Manhattan, before he escaped to the British, to London for 5 years to avoid going to prison. Why did all of these Americans get shot? What's the common denominator going all the way up to John F. Kennedy and his brother and Martin Luther King? What is there a common sort of policy that they're tapping into and channeling? And sure enough, the more you start pursuing that question, the more discoveries are to be found. And so in the course of volume 1, which tackled 1776 to 1890, it dealt with that period of history in looking at, sometimes people today have given it the term deep state, and every country has its own deep state, something that is embedded as something within the structures of power, academia, media, military affairs, banking, that is interconnected. It's different parts of the same beast, and we have it in Canada, we have it in the US, we have it in almost every country. I think every country you could find aspects of this type of thing. And so I tried to paint the picture of some of the drama that is lesser appreciated around the Civil War, around the battle to just how did America grow from 13 colonies to being the thing we know of it as today. How did that happen? Was there a fight? Were there different intentions, different political agencies? And so there are two traditions, two opposing currents. And when you do look at the deaths of those greater American leaders, from Warren Harding, I mean, that's a 20th century one, but you can go to Harrison, Zachary Taylor, Lincoln. You could look at even people like Vice President Garrett Hobart under McKinley, and McKinley himself, and Garfield, or all of these great leaders who tend to die while in office are actually invoking what you have written about quite a bit, which I found very inspiring, which is a certain principle of constitutional banking, constitutional foreign policy, like the idea that the Constitution is not just ink on parchment, but it is a governing principle of finance, of foreign policy, of cultural policy, of the general welfare, right? And that all people are endowed with certain inalienable rights. That's in the Declaration of Independence. And so the purpose of having a national bank, which Hamilton pioneered, is to emit large-scale credit. It's to be a servant of the people, to be an instrument of the nation state for the purpose of pulling people out of poverty, enhancing the powers of productivity, investing in large-scale, long-term projects that normally private finance would never have the patience or be willing to take the sorts of risk that one would need to take to build an Erie Canal, although that was partially funded by private finance, but it was an initiative that involved the sovereign backing of the state, or the Transcontinental Railway, or more recently things like the Apollo space program or things like that. You need to have that initiative that is taken by a sovereign nation state. So in volume 2, which is called Open versus Closed Systems Collide, with a picture of Zbigniew Brzezinski and John F. Kennedy, a painting of him with an explosion in between, I try to just get across from 1890 until the present time how this has played out, especially with the the murder of William McKinley.
Yeah, you also called it republicanism versus hereditary, two systems of control. One is hereditary, meaning like the king or, something totally top down. And then Republican being that we are all sovereign and like every race, etc. And with certain inalienable rights. So they're not even built into the Constitution. They're actually something that you're born with. There, all those freedoms are freedoms that I think that's what attracts people to that model, the American model. What detracts all the immigrants here is that it's a form of freedom that they didn't have at home with their own top-down sort of governments.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and we underestimate just what a revolution of morality that was, to be able to create a nation founded upon the idea of a rejection of hereditary rights. Because before the American Republic was set up, all the world knew were systems of governments founded upon, I'm born into a a certain family, and that simple birthright gives me the right to take away or bestow rights on the slave families, people born into the lower caste. It was a caste structure with certain titles of nobility and things that just, enhance the egotistical elitism, which is just always the fertile soil for corruption, is a sense of elitism that, we are sovereign. And all of the oligarchical systems before the United States organized themselves around certain hereditary institutions. You had one sovereign, you had one king or queen who was like the prima inter pares, the first among equals. And they were the ones who then, again, like in the Canadian constitutions, not that we really have a constitution, but in our charter, our series of charters going back to the 18th century, we got a whole series of these things that really just portray, including the British North America Act or the 1982 Charter. They say that, we have these rights. It seems right for life, liberty, happiness, like things that are very similar to that of the United States, but it's not recognized as inalienable. It's Her Majesty has bestowed upon us. And, in our Constitution, it says that our nation will be enshrined as a constitution, is the 1867 version, for the benefit and interests of the British Empire. How is that a nation, versus the United States, which is for the general welfare of the people? A nation for, by, and of the people is a very different concept. So unfortunately, the US has not always acted the part of its ideals, as is, often the case with all of us. We have ideals and we go through times in our lives where we sometimes make bad decisions. We find addictions that take more and more control of us as personalities, and we can decay, we can go on a bad path. And if we're fortunate enough to discover some humility, we can get back to our senses and make reparations for ourselves, get back onto the right path. A nation state has a lot of similarities to a personality in that sense, except the nation state transcends individual lifespans, right? So we see the US has at different times gone through periods of perfectibility, improvement of itself, of its people, and of its future by creating sacrifices for the future generations. And then you have periods of decline of where it got onto the wrong track. And usually you'll find that those periods of corruption didn't come naturally, but came through a lot of effort. There's a lot of work that was required to set the US on a different path. And if you look at who takes over, usually the positions of power structures after the death of or the murder of an Abraham Lincoln. And in my books, I've gone through how that was orchestrated by British intelligence working with Confederate intelligence in Montreal, Canada, where I live. Sorry about that. If you look at what type of machine took power with Lincoln's murder, and especially McKinley's murder 35 or so years later in 1901, there was you can get a sense of how the US was brought into a sort of power relationship with its arch nemesis, the British Empire. And this is the case with Teddy Roosevelt, with increasingly Woodrow Wilson, was a reemergence of a racist impulse where the slave power, the slaveocracy of the Confederate South was repowered. Things like the KKK were created, protected, and that blossomed for an internal corruption, along with things like, a secret police force set up under Teddy Roosevelt that came to be known as the FBI. Later on, and also like an idea of an Anglo-American special relationship, that it is our racist Anglo-Saxon rights with the British to rule the world together. That was, again, what was brought in after McKinley was killed. And same thing when Franklin Roosevelt died, who was against imperialism. Franklin Roosevelt, just like McKinley or Warren Harding or even Lincoln, had a vision of destroying the hereditary structures and empires from the earth by helping poor countries who had been victimized to develop the means, not just give them money or give them some fish, but provide them the means to learn how to fish, to give them industrial sovereignty through large-scale loans that would be internationalized. And when Roosevelt died, same sort of thing happened. The patriots who understood the nature of what this corruption was in Wall Street with military intelligence, with the FBI and everything else, they were purged. All of FDR's allies who shared his vision of a US, China, Russia alliance for the post-war age that would help poor countries develop their infrastructure along the lines of what we saw with the Tennessee Valley Authority inside of the United States. I mean, people like Kwame Nkrumah, leaders of the Pan-African movement, leaders from South America came, right, in the 1930s to study how did America go from backwater illiteracy in the Tennessee and much of the South to becoming an industrial aerospace pioneer through things like the rural electrification projects that were funded by not Wall Street, but the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which became sort of a government entity that acted much like a national bank should act. That was all undone when Roosevelt died, a little bit too early, I might add, under very questionable circumstances. And no autopsy was done. So anybody who tries to just tell me, just don't think about it, it was a brain hemorrhage or heart failure or something. There was never an autopsy, so I don't care what people say. That's you can't know that. But what you can know is that Stalin did tell Churchill's son Elliot that it was Churchill's people who did it, just like they had been trying, as Stalin is recorded in this interview as having said, just like he suspected they were also doing the same to him. You've got a lot of circumstantial evidence, but the key point of evidence isn't so much the conspiracy theory side of things. It's really what changed policy wise. And sure enough, when Truman came in, just like when Teddy came in as the notoriously corrupt, idiotic vice president under McKinley, same thing with Truman, who was again a racist little man who he was an Anglophile. He adored how the British were able to just dominate the world. And, they purged the OSS, got rid of all of FDR's allies in positions of influence, and very quickly created things like, the CIA in 1947, the Truman Doctrine to start encouraging the US, instead of working with its allies that it needed to put the fascist machine down, like China and Russia, who, again, suffered the most in World War II fighting fascism. They were now going to be relabeled as the new global supervillains. And Churchill was more than happy to oblige by coming to Missouri and giving his famous Iron Curtain speech, which I go through in, I think, chapter 12 of my book, on how the British orchestrated this Iron Curtain, much like what we see today with, things like the Democracy Summit, which half of the world's countries are not invited. They've been excluded from this new Democracy Summit that's now happening this week, which is, again, a new Iron Curtain idea of taking the people that you worked with and making them your enemies. And bombs were unnecessarily dropped after FDR died onto a defeated Japan. This is very well known that Japan had already begun backdoor peace negotiations to try to surrender and save face. That was all ignored, and bombs were unnecessarily dropped as a real statement to the Soviets and to anybody, frankly, that the new game in town was not going to be FDR's vision of a world of international New Deals, building and ending poverty according to the idea of the four freedoms, which Henry Wallace shared, as did Harry Dexter White, the first founder of the IMF, who was working very closely with Wallace and FDR, again, who also died mysteriously in 1948. So again, there was this huge battle, and there's these incredible stories in the early days, especially the early 16 years after World War II had ended, which I try to tell in Act 3 of my book, which people can't see because I think your broadcast is over the radio. But anyway, here, because it'll eventually be a video. So yeah, and I try to tell some of those stories, including some people like Paul Robeson and others.
So thanks. Yeah, we're particularly focused, of course, on the money issues.
Yeah.
And it seems to me, and bringing it forward to how it's relevant today, it seems to me that the two Americas we have today, or the side that's sort of the imperial side, is no longer one monarch. It's fascism, really. I mean, it's a corporate takeover, or big corporations are in power together. So we got the World Economic Forum. Well, anyway, that whole faction. So just following the finances, it seems to me that same money power is still basically in control, or maybe it's the same mindset. I don't know, but they never really gave up. I mean,
No.
not the nice British people that we know. That's not what we're talking about. But the British money power, the British banking power, never really gave up. I mean, their whole model, of course, is, well, what I write about is that they create the money. I mean, banks in general create the money as loans, and they always require more back than they put out there. So invariably, they're going to wind up with all the property, with all the money. So, and, you know, eventually the debt gets to be too big, or you have too much speculation. Like in 1929, we had the same thing going on that we had in the 2008, where you have all this speculation and then suddenly it collapses, and the insiders who still have money can buy up buy things up cheaply. And we're seeing that in spades right now, where the billionaire class is buying up everything. They're buying up the land, they're buying up the water, and they're calling it, for the benefit of nature, which obviously is not true. So we are going to be in the position of, you will own nothing and be happy. If we're happy, it's because they're going to be pumping us full of drugs, because we're not, I mean, it's not our nature to be happy with having nothing and having no rights.
You'll have a nice little plot of land in your alternative world run by, Mark Zuckerberg. VR machines, which you can now, they're saying you can now invest in these plots of land, and you can now have like real estate speculation in this alternative virtual universe of
the metaverse.
In the metaverse, you can now own land and get, so they're creating a new speculative bubble, even further detached from reality, if that was possible. I thought it was about as far removed from reality as it could be with modern derivatives, but no, they're going further. Yeah.
And one thing interesting you wrote about was that FDR was not a Keynesian, and that Keynes was really another one of these big the British money people. So do you want to explain that, what the real dichotomy is versus what we've been led to believe?
Yeah, that'll freak a lot of people out, and it does. It pisses a lot of people off when I bring this up. But that's chapter 16, The Ugly Truth of John Maynard Keynes and the Battle of Bretton Woods. It's a longer chapter in my book, but no, there's been you touched on the World Economic Forum, so I'm just going to run with that for a second. But there's not just the idea that you'll own nothing and be happy in a great reset, but there's an idea of a great narrative that's also been launched, the Great Narrative Project that has been launched by Klaus Schwab, bringing together the world's billionaires and philosophers, at least those who are acceptable to the class that they're beholden to spin new, comprehensive, cohesive narratives for the future of humanity. A lot of transhumanists are involved in this as well. And it gets nasty. But narrative, this is not a new thing. So narrative construction and the weaving of tales is a part of our human collective experience. The question has always been, are the narratives that are being created stories that edify and give us better access to our full potentials of actualizing our moral conscience, our minds that are in tune with our conscience and our hearts, which is what they call a well-integrated person, a mature person, right? Where our bodies are always going to grow, but it's not necessarily the case that our minds and our emotions will also mature in harmony with our bodies. That's a maybe. It should be. We're happier when they do, but it's rarer. And when you live under an empire, and unfortunately, most of human society, we've never escaped empire. We've always had this latching onto us as a parasite for recorded human civilization, and it's taken different forms, but there's certain invariants, certain common characteristics. One of those is the crushing of our ability to actualize our true creative potential, our goodness, as much as possible. And so we're told, we've had these Leonardo da Vinci's, and we've had these Beethovens and Keplers, but those are the special geniuses that are not the normal. Everybody else is destined to a life of normal, but it's like, what is normal, right? Maybe those have actually been natural, normal people, and the masses, right? What is popular has tended to be the unnatural state of those who have not been given the ability to properly experience who they are. Da Vinci, for example, never had to compartmentalize anything, right? He learned early on how to find a love and a passion for truth in a very flexible way. He saw the universality in music, in optics, in machinery, in painting. And so you have what are called Renaissance people, right? And I'm doing this in a circuitous way, but I'm going to get back to your original question, I promise. So the great narrative thing is really, do these narratives, these stories, help us bring that about? Because some stories do that, you know? I'd say many of the best religions, what makes them good and powerful is that they have stories that will allow people, enhance our ability to tap into those better sides of ourselves. And then, or will it be based upon the imperial power structure or imperial set of high priests who will weave stories that will destroy that ability? So I'm saying all this in a nonlinear way, and I'm so sorry. I'm going to get back to your Keynes question, okay? So we've been told FDR was a Keynesian. That's what we were told. And in my chapter, in several chapters, I get across how not only was FDR anti-Keynesian, but Keynes also directly thought FDR was an incompetent when it comes to economics, and he wrote as much. It's recorded by Francis Perkins, a very close ally of FDR. FDR also thought and openly stated that Keynes was not a real economist, but simply a mathematician with fetishes. And when you start looking at the real Keynes as a eugenicist, somebody who was a devout member of the Eugenics Society, who was a complete racist, and you could read his quotes that I cite. This guy really, really, really was up there. A devout Malthusian, believed completely that the purpose of government and banking, well, he thought the purpose of government was to be subservient to the higher supranational interests of finance, of central banks. So he's a central banker, and he didn't believe in the nation state. He thought that had to ultimately go, but that ultimately the purpose of law and economic policy was to advance population control. He was also a pedophile too, but that's another story. Now, in Bretton Woods, he was there representing the British Empire. That was his position. So, Churchill on the one hand represented a more right-wing conservative view of the old school British Empire of, Hail Britannia, Britannia rules the waves, crush the natives, the Reds and he was just openly, just vitriolically racist and bad. Old school British imperialists, whereas Keynes was more of what you consider the Fabian Society, play it slow, be subtle, be more sophisticated approach, which is ultimately what won out in the post-war age. So they tried, like World War I, and I get through how World War I and World War II were artificial orchestrations to destroy a process internationally. And it's all about start global, just like in 1776, start with the global chemistry first. What were the terms shaping the world? And then go down and isolate and analyze the parts from the whole first, right? So it was a same thing with the murder of McKinley. It wasn't just McKinley dying. McKinley represented an international movement that was blossoming in Russia during McKinley's time, you had Sergei Witte, the finance minister and later prime minister of Russia. You had Gabriel Hanotaux and Sadi Carnot, the president of France and his foreign minister as well. You had allies in Japan, in China, who were all working to bring about a world of cooperating sovereign nation state republics that would be cooperating around big projects like rail specifically. The Trans-Siberian Railway was a big one modeled on the US Transcontinental Railway, which was completed, although it wasn't permitted to properly drive a real industrial process the way Witte, an American system economist in Russia, had envisioned, or Otto von Bismarck's people in Germany were similarly advancing this in a very serious way. They were all rejecting British free trade, and instead they were going for national economics protectionism, the way the United States had done. They were all modeling it on that. And so the chessboard was kicked over, and I go through the details of how the World War I was orchestrated. The same thing for World War II. There was an effort to just sort of, again, break the world into a state of shock where people would then be more susceptible to accepting fascism as a global economic solution, which is why Madison Square Garden in New York was a major had pro-Nazi rallies. People don't want to admit this, but you could see the pictures. The Nazi Party of the United States was huge. They were having giant marches through New Jersey with, regular Americans carrying the American flags with Nazi swastikas, doing the Hitler salutes. That was a big thing all over the US, all over Canada, which is where I am. Fascism was being sold as the economic miracle solution to all of our economic woes that were caused by the Great Depression, which, as you pointed out, was an artificial creation. A bunch of bubbles were created speculatively on broker call loans that were overextended, and they were systematically called in at the same moment, which resulted in the foreseeable defaults of all sorts of unpayable debts that were incurred, and the bubbles went into a chain reaction deleveraging, Black Tuesday, 4 years of hell. And again, those who were in the know, who did the pinpricking, were the ones who would position themselves to do a big wealth transfer, sell their stocks short early before the thing had popped, and then buy up pennies on the dollar thereafter while supporting fascism financially. Like that's where the Bush family fortune comes from. So I'm saying all of this again, and I go into my contextual circuitous things, and I'm so sorry, but John Maynard Keynes was designed to represent the more subtle Fabian faction. And Fabianism, from the London School of Economics, was always a pro-eugenics society. It modeled itself somewhat as a Marxist, socialist, pro-labor movement, but it really had a hierarchical structure inside of it. So those on the inner echelons, as Keynes was, as a Cambridge apostle, somebody who's very high up in the British Empire's deep state, his job was to try to orchestrate the terms of the post-war age and Bretton Woods as being one dominated by the Bancor, a common sort of basis of exchange where everybody would have to have Bancor credits that would kind of be like today's strategic, or the drawing rights in the IMF. But back then it was the Bancor that he wanted as sort of a step towards a one world currency controlled by the Bank of England. And the preservation ultimately of the possessions, the territorial interests of the British Empire globally. The Churchill faction, really, they've proven that they were too sloppy, too barbaric in their approach. And so people who were representing FDR, at the time it was primarily Morgenthau and Harry Dexter White, they were successful in not giving they gave some inches, but they made sure that Keynes didn't get what he wanted. And instead it was the post-war currency was premised around a fixed exchange rate to make it impossible to conduct currency speculation. That was always that's not a new thing. Yeah. That went back a very long time. Speculative warfare, currency speculation as a form of keeping your victim country on their knees and not standing on their own 2 feet. The right of every country to have access to protectionism was also enshrined as a principle of action. And the idea of the IMF and the World Bank in those days was to serve as simply as instruments to be kind of like international reconstruction finance corporations, to provide long-term credit for big projects that would pull people out of poverty and provide the means of helping yourself, right, around the world. And luckily, Keynes lost that battle, but as I mentioned before, these allies of FDR were purged, Wallace was ousted, and Harry Dexter White was campaigning for Wallace when Wallace was basically fighting against the Cold War doctrine and trying to say, no, let's actually work with Russia, work with China like FDR intended. And by him doing that, and also warning that the fascists in America who had funded Hitler, there's speeches where he's actually calling them out while he's Commerce Secretary, the former vice president under FDR. He's downgraded, but he's still a power. And he's literally calling out these same fascists are preparing for Anglo-American imperialism and a war with Russia that will destroy the world. And he's basically saying it openly, and that's why he's fired. And he runs for president. And Harry Dexter White, the first IMF director, is campaigning for him. And he dies after he's being called a red commie traitor and being dragged over into the House of Un-American Activities. As are many of the greatest American patriots. They're systematically destroyed and slandered beyond belief. But no, Keynes certainly was not what we're told he is, and FDR was not a Keynesian. He was a direct follower of the American system of political economy. And I have a chapter in there going through the networks that were working with Roosevelt from both parties, Democrat and Republican, who represented the Abraham Lincoln, McKinley, and even Warren Harding policy orientation towards pro-protectionism, large-scale credit, all of these things that define the American system of political economy. So yeah, he was not that. And so the whole Keynes thing was created to obscure that, as is the opposing view that, Americans are told you have a choice. You could either be a Keynesian, which is like, that's usually, it means you're going to become a Democrat, or if you're going to become a follower of the Austrian school of von Hayek, and then you're going to be probably, a Republican. And we're told fit into one of these two boxes, but it's like both of these boxes, what was Friedrich von Hayek? The whole Hayek versus Keynes debate was cooked up at the end of 1932 when it was apparent that Roosevelt was about to win the presidency. And it was created as a way to create an artificial polarization, right? Where you're told either you're for absolute individual liberty, and that's going to define what's good, is the government just getting off your back and letting everybody just do what they want and let the market, hidden hands, invisible hands, organize themselves mystically, which never works, by the way. That's even when Adam Smith was commissioned by the British Empire to promote that idea with the Wealth of Nations in 1776, not a coincidence. He was working for the British Empire. He was commissioned to promote and to create an argument for why the United States should not have any say over its economic destiny and just let the markets be. And meanwhile, the British East India Company and the private financial houses, they don't care. They're happy to walk into your house when your guard is down, your door is unlocked, and just steal everything. That's why free trade existed. So at least on that scale. And so, I mean, the repackaging of Adam Smith under the Habsburg dynasty, under Karl Menger, right? The guy who created the Austrian school, it was just a repackaging of Smith on behalf of, he was the retainer of the Habsburg Empire. That's why they call it the Austrian school. All of these guys are von this, von that, Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich von Hayek. They're all like part of the nobility trying to promote our freedoms. And it's like, no, these guys were this is a false debate created by the London School of Economics. That's where it happened, Keynes versus the Austrian school. And everyone was told either you're for, big government arbitrarily spending, the way Keynes says, to just make the economy's engine rev again when you have an economic crisis. Just spend arbitrarily, pay somebody to dig a hole, pay somebody else to fill a hole. In Keynes's world, there's no difference. Or let the government just get it off your back, let people just do what they're going to do and spend what they're going to spend, and that will just stimulate the economy. Neither one works. They're both traps. You will be raped in both cases. And that is indeed what happened throughout the remaining, 70 years of the Cold War.
And then bringing it back to the forward to the present, yeah. We need to, right now we have the Great Reset going on at the World Economic Forum, which obviously resets are something that they do periodically when there's no way to deal with the debt. And right now it's the debt and the derivatives. So they have to start out, somehow they have to reset the games. And so that's what they're obviously up to. And it seems to me we're at the point where we have to come up with our own reset, our people's, in other words, like you said about creating a vision or a model, I forgot the word, but anyway, a paradigm, we need to form our own paradigm. So what do you propose for that? I mean, I have ideas, but.
The beauty of history is it gives you it's a real proof of principle scientific experiment. There's theories that are tried, that are tested, and you see what works or doesn't work. And that approach to history is what's been obscured from us. We're taught history incompetently, as if it was just a memorization of a bunch of things that happened and plug a date next to the event, put it on a timeline, and say that's history. It's all about the past. What happened in 1890 has no bearing on what's happening today. Look how much space in time is separating our two processes. What can you learn? And it's like, no, looking at history from this other standpoint that I'm trying to get at is actually you start realizing that though separated by many generations, it's very similar principles that are, I would say, even the same principles of good versus bad ideas that work or don't work. And the real crisis sets in when people often try to say, well, without having properly studied their history, they just say, well, whatever happened in the past, I'm just going to try to create something new. Because everything that worked in the past, everything that happened in the past brought us to the present bad circumstances. So they couldn't be good. There couldn't be anything good in the past. And so you get a lot of this, let's just deconstruct, all irrelevant thinkers, dead white European males, and let's just go for like new thinkers, new thoughts that are relevant for our ugly times. That creates a big mess because, as I think people who are listened to you over your radio broadcast are aware and read your works, that's not true. There's a lot you can learn from people of all colors. There's bad ideas and good ideas represented by white people and people of all colors. And so you want to look for the good ideas and see where they work. So you want to make sure there's a precedent in history and in the human experience. The idea of the sovereign nation state, one thing, again, the Great Reset crowd is devoutly hateful of the idea of the sovereign nation state. They want to say that that's an obsolete thing and that we have to get rid of to create one world institutions that really care about the people and care about nature. That's really what we want to do. And, corporations and central banks, they're above the selfish, localized interest of a nation state. They care about the global community and the global environment. And that's why we should give them the control, as you've written about in your works, and I've written a bit about this too. They should control the Amazon rainforest, and they should control the American farmlands, and they should control our quotas of how much we're allowed to breathe CO2 into the world. They're the ones who are responsible and should decide those things, not selfish nation states. Now, the reality is nation states are an instrument created by human beings as part of the freedom struggle to emancipate ourselves from empire. That's why we have sovereign nation states. And so to have a strong sovereign nation state is important as a weapon, because this thing controlling the Great Reset, we see shadows of it with the Great Reset. It's very powerful. It's very centralized. It's global, and only a powerful weapon like the sovereign nation state can properly protect people and take away the ability of this parasite to keep its tentacles stuck into the host. So today, the right to emit productive credit through a national bank on a state and federal level, this is something that you've educated your readers on for many years, and this is a very important principle. Everybody has the right to not pay illegitimate debts. There's such a thing as a legit debt, and if you took a legit debt, you're obliged to pay it. But if you've been tricked into a usurious trap, no, you don't have to do it. If it was designed to keep you enslaved, which that's been the past 80-year experience, especially in the post-war age, is IMF, World Bank, conditionality-laced loans that were designed to destroy the means of producing wealth by the victim countries who were unfortunate enough to receive those types of loans with those conditionalities that said that we'll give you the money at these extremely high interest rates on the condition that you don't use it for building this hydroelectric dam on your country, or using this to build something like, tap into the oil or other mineral under your soil in Nigeria in any way that is going to benefit the quality of life of your people. If anything, we'll let you do it under the condition that a foreign corporation goes in, controls your oil reserves to export to our consumer markets, which is what Henry Kissinger put forth in his NSSM 200. So the United States and any country that wants to survive the coming storm, and it's going to get worse before it gets better, has to revive that process that every great American president was tapping into that within varying degrees. There's countries.
The Chinese are actually tapping into it now with the Belt and Road Initiative, which is, more or less modeled on the American system. You could go into that a bit.
Yeah, sure. Well, that's the punchline. So that's the sixth act. So my book is divided into 6 acts with about, anywhere between 5 to 9 chapters per act. And the last act, Act 6. So Act 5 is on the recolonization of the United States after JFK was killed and his brother was killed. So what happened from 1968 up until our present period, especially, and I spent a lot of time focusing on the 1970s as a point where the Trilateral Commission of Kissinger, David Rockefeller, Brzezinski was really taking control more and more of America's banking policy. People like Paul Volcker was a member of that trilateral commission, right? And it was rewiring the U.S. to break it away from its past better traditions and into this idea of a hegemon that would be part of the Anglo-American process of conquering the world and getting rid of all multipolar ideas of foreign policy and economics and reducing everybody to one center of command above everyone else. That's what Zbigniew Brzezinski launched. A lot of the neoconservatives that later took power under Bush Jr., the monkey, these guys all came in under the Trilateral Commission sort of field of influence. And there was a little bit of pushback here and there in the 1980s, but overall the process was degenerative. And what I try to get across is that was all an economic reconquest of the United States. That was not the United States acting in its own sovereign interest. That's why JFK and his brother were killed, was because they were representing the actual sovereign interests. And this other thing came on. It was a coup. And people have to internalize that it was a coup. It wasn't something that happened 58 years ago. It's something that still is happening, even though people have died along the way, who were part of it. It's still a coup. And today, yes, so chapter 6 is how the Multipolar Alliance that was really took form after 2013 when Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Initiative, but also when Putin, who people have been taught to hate and fear because there's a lot of, people who listen to the media. That's just part of life. So anyway, it happens. But Russia and China have integrated their two systems to become the bedrocks, along with Iran, which has now been brought in with a giant $400 billion deal finalized now to integrate itself as a major ancient civilization into the Multipolar Alliance that has as its defining policy the Belt and Road Initiative, or the New Silk Road. That was what Xi Jinping unveiled in 2013. In 2015 is when Putin started with his military capabilities, which are more advanced than China's. China's good at building economic things, like they could build a bridge or a high-speed rail or anything very effectively. And they have a lot of economic sovereignty because they didn't give up their national banks, whereas we did. They actually have 4 major state banks that emit credit for 10 to 30-year projects, like their Move South Water North project. That thing is going to be finished in 2055. That's a long-term thinking. We used to do that. We don't do that anymore. And that's also why there's now a big shifting right now in the Middle East. There's a hope for reconstruction in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya. There's real hope because the Belt and Road Initiative is coming through the Middle Eastern zone to connect east-west, but also throughout Africa, throughout the Arctic, as part of the Polar Silk Road. And it's being funded with it's an alternative financial architecture. And it's open for invitation that the leaders, they'll never tell you this on CNN or Fox News, but if you actually look at their speeches over the course of the last 7 years, the leadership of Eurasia has invited on multiple occasions the West to stop this zero-sum Hobbesian closed system thinking and instead join this open system, non-zero-sum process of cooperation and win-win cooperation, right? There's forms of economic activity that don't involve just one participant losing and the other one gaining by theft. Believe it or not, there's actually a way of doing things economically where you can make billions of dollars or more by doing things that benefit all participants. Let's say building a new infrastructure system in Kenya or in Ethiopia, which is what's happening with, the Chinese helping Ethiopia as a center of development of electrified rail and sanitation and education. It's all happening. And that's why Ethiopia is being targeted also by Washington for destabilization currently. And they want to make Ethiopia the new Libya 2.0. So China is actually saying, no, let's put out the fires. Let's work to create a system like McKinley was doing when he was looking at international cooperation around South America, building rail from the United States all the way down through the Panama Canal, stretching all the way through South America as a driver for mass industrialization so that these countries could stand on their own 2 feet. That's what McKinley was doing. That's what FDR was doing. That's what JFK was doing with his allies like Kwame Nkrumah, who he was helping to build the big dam on the Volta River in Ghana, and many people like that. And Bobby Kennedy was talking in those lines too. That's what he would have done had he become president. So yeah, today, though most Americans might walk into some cognitive dissonance on hearing us say this, the fact is that with all of the problems, and there are deep state structures in both Russia and China. Okay, I'm not trying to say that they're angels. I'm not saying that, but yes, they're actually reigning in their deep states there. We, in our case, like Soros is not allowed to be in China. He can't operate anything in China since 1989. He's been banned. Whereas his open societies and everything else are all over our governments in official and non-official ways, and academia. So they're actually picking up the torch that was dropped by the great American presidents of the past, and they don't want World War III. The country that is driving the military encirclement of Russia, China, that's fueling separatist movements through color revolutions, that's not Russia or China. That's the Anglo-American groupings here. That's us. We got to clean up our backyard. And the best way to clean up our backyard, the best pathway to do that is by working with countries that want a future, that have said we can do this all together. We can build infrastructure in America together. And I would say that's the most efficient way. If we're going to be able to get national banking again, it's going to be by us eating some humble pie and cooperating with these countries that don't want war.
So we're coming to about the end of our time, but one thing I was really interested in was the whole limits to growth idea. And Lincoln said, that only man, many animals can work or labor, but only man improves his labor. In other words, the Malthusian or eugenics approach is that we've got too many people because we're going to run out of supplies and stuff. But Lincoln's concept, and I think the American concept in general, or whatever, it's not necessarily American, but the human concept, that what's different about us is that we have these brains and these imaginations and this ability to figure more efficient ways to use the resources we have, or to find more efficient forms of energy, et cetera, that it's a matter of having faith in our own humanity, whatever. I don't know. Do you want to talk about that?
Oh, that's beautifully said,
inspirational
Ellen.
Here.
Oh, no, you're great, Ellen. You're great. No, that's exactly it. I mean, you said it well. And yeah, the whole, when you really read some of these speeches, like what you just cited, Lincoln's Discoveries and Inventions, he thought that was that's his favorite speech from, I think it was 1858. And yeah, it's very clear when you look at the terms of the battle that was being waged, even then, it was how do you define human beings? Because the economic system, we're the only creature that creates laws, economic laws, political laws, cultural law. Like, we create rules, and when you put them all together, we call it a system. It's an invisible sphere that shapes us. It's tied to our culture. Animals, they are totally defined by their hereditary impulses, the material conditions of the biosphere of their ecosystem that they're born into. That is going to determine every other animal species. Their limits will be that, and at a certain point, if there's a drought, the mommy rabbits are going to eat their baby rabbits, and we're not going to put them in prison for that. That's just the way that nature works. It's not good or bad. It's devoid of that quality of morality. But it's fine the way it is, it's a precious thing, nature. But when you try to,
do you know the book, The Origins of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind?
No, I don't.
Probably not. Well, so it's a Duke professor, but he said that, so animals are actually behaving based on the subconscious, it's just instinct. So they do it there, or even fear or whatever. It's a subconscious drive. And so, he takes it back to the difference between the Iliad and the Odyssey. So in the Iliad, the hero always had the god by his side, and the god told him what to do, and he did it. And then in the Odyssey, the god is gone, and it's this, my God, why hast thou forsaken me type thing. And so in the Odyssey, the hero has to make his own decisions. So that's what I saw some other I forget who, but anyway, saying that what it is to be human versus the AI, for example, what it is to be human is that we make our own choices and we decide which way we're going to go. And so
no, that's exactly it. Yeah, we're a creature of free will, and we have a conscience. We can
free will, that's it. Yes.
Yeah, like that allows us to improve our system, and we can choose to live by unnatural systems. A bird it's like thinking of a bird that is convinced that it's a fish, and for a while it might behave like a fish, but if it doesn't realize sooner than later that it's wrong and get back out there and learn how to fly again, it'll drown. Things are not going to go well. It'll be less capable of being happy as time progresses. And it's sort of like that with human beings. You could say that, yeah, the laws of the jungle are what defines us. It's pure selfishness, the ability of the weaker or the ability of the stronger to suppress the weaker, and race for diminishing returns in a fight for survival or something. You could say that, and for a while you could impose that onto the human system, that ideology that defines all of your other elements of the system. And just like that bird, over time, people will become more miserable, more depressed, all sorts of bad symptoms will happen. And unless you can get to the heart of the problem, which is that we're actually made in the image of a divine creative force, and that this is what Lincoln firmly understood, that we're the only creature to improve our craftsmanship. The beaver makes a dam. It's industrious, but it's the same dam today that it was building 5,000 years ago.
Same dam.
Yeah, same dam. And so we can improve our dams. We can improve our technologies. We can even leap to new resources that didn't exist when we're discovering principles of the universe. We could translate that metaphorically through, whether you want in science, through symbolic language like math, or even through music or painting. These are forms of invoking and awakening a certain set of insights about what we are when it's done well. And the effect is we can improve and self-perfect ever more perfectly, which was understood when you look at the American Constitution, right? The idea of a more perfect union would be a logical absurdity for somebody who thinks like a pure computer. Like, how could you be more and perfect? Either you're more of something or you're perfect. It's a fixed state or something that's changing. And no, the founding fathers didn't have that problem. They understood that it's we're a perfectible species with no end. And to the degree that we are tuning ourselves to the laws of nature, we're going to be better. Empires, the parasite will have less fertile soil to stick its tentacles in, and empires know this too. There's a cultural war, and that's I think more important even than the financial, military, political aspects of analysis. It's the cultural war, which is the heart and soul of the species. So that's there too. And I try to, there's Act 4, I try to get at the cultural intermezzo in my book. So hopefully people like the book. And yeah, the open versus closed system idea, that's everything. It really gets you at the idea of either we're a Malthusian beast that's going to adapt in a social Darwinian or eugenics type of structure of the rule of the might makes right. Or we are something more like Lincoln believed and I think understood as a creature always that's more than the sum of our parts. And because of that, we can always leap beyond our limits to growth by being moral enough to make discoveries and also to translate those discoveries to the overall productive process to sustain not only more people, but at a higher quality of life. And in so doing, also improve nature. So usually we're told either you're going to have more people or you're going to have better nature, but you can't have both. I would say, and Lincoln was right, you can have both, and we're more, natural and happier when we do that. And empires don't want us to think so.
All right, thanks. Well, we're at the end of our time. So I've been speaking with Matthew Ehret, who's editor-in-chief of the Canadian Patriot Review, co-founder of the Montreal-based Rising Tide Foundation. His latest book is The Clash of Two Americas, Volume 2, The Unfinished Symphony. And I believe your website is canadianpatriot.org. Is that right?
You got it. That's it.
Okay. Thanks, Matt.
Hey, thank you.